Imagine this: a nation, centuries old, a tapestry woven with diverse cultures, religions, and languages, suddenly finds itself torn apart, not by internal strife alone, but by a deliberate, calculated hand guiding the needle of discord. This is not fiction. This is the stark reality of British colonial India, a legacy of division and violence that continues to scar the subcontinent. Today, we uncover the truth, the uncomfortable, undeniable truth, of how the British employed a sinister strategy of divide and rule to cement their power, specifically through the systematic communalization of Hindus and Muslims. We begin with a question that should haunt us all. Was the partition of India, the bloodiest event of the 20th century, an inevitable tragedy or a meticulously crafted crime? The evidence overwhelmingly points to the latter. For over 2 centuries, the British Empire, driven by economic exploitation and imperial ambition, understood that a united India was a threat. A united India meant a stronger India, a nation capable of resisting foreign domination. So they set about creating fissures, widening existing cracks, and ultimately shattering a civilization. The British didn't invent religious differences in India. Hinduism and Islam had coexisted, often peacefully, for centuries. There were periods of tension, as there are in any society with diverse populations. But what the British did was different. They took these differences, magnified them, politicized them, and weaponized them. They didn't just observe, they actively manufactured religious animosity for their own gain. Let's go back to the early days of British influence. The East India Company, initially a trading enterprise, gradually morphed into a political power. As their control expanded, so did their understanding of how to manage their vast, diverse territory. Lord William Bentinck, Governor-General in the 1830s, is often lauded for his reforms, like the abolition of sati. But even in this era, the seeds of division were being sown, albeit subtly. The British actively began to record and categorize Indians based on religion in a way that had never been done before. Censuses, introduced by the British in the 19th century, became not just tools for administration but instruments of division. They meticulously documented Hindu and Muslim populations, their supposed numbers, their perceived strengths and weaknesses. This seemingly neutral act of data collection had a profound psychological impact. It encouraged people to see themselves and others primarily through a religious lens, fostering a sense of distinct, and often opposing, identities. But it was after the Indian Mutiny of 1857 that the strategy of divide and rule truly came into its own. The Mutiny, a widespread rebellion against British rule, exposed the vulnerability of the empire. In its aftermath, the British developed a deep-seated fear of a united Indian front. They sought to create internal divisions that would weaken any future resistance. One of the most egregious examples of this strategy can be seen in the way the British actively fostered separate political identities for Hindus and Muslims. They began to patronize certain groups over others, often along religious lines, to prevent the emergence of a unified nationalist movement. Sir John Strachey, in his book India, Its Administration and Progress, published in 1903, openly admitted the British policy. The great body of the people are still very far from having reached a political level which would render it possible for them to dispense with the guiding hand of the European. This guiding hand, however, was far from benevolent. The Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 were a watershed moment. While presented as a move towards self-governance, they enshrined the principle of separate electorates. This meant that Hindus could only vote for Hindu candidates and Muslims for Muslim candidates. This was a masterstroke of manipulation. It created legislative bodies where religious affiliation, rather than political ideology or merit, became the primary basis for representation. It institutionalized religious difference, making it a fundamental aspect of political life. Think about the implications. Instead of working together on common issues like poverty, education, or infrastructure, politicians were incentivized to appeal to their specific religious constituencies. This naturally led to the amplification of grievances, real or imagined, between communities. The British argument was that this was to protect minority rights, but the reality was that it created a permanent minority complex and fueled distrust. The British also engaged in historical revisionism. They selectively interpreted and presented Indian history to emphasize conflict between Hindus and Muslims, ignoring periods of cooperation and syncretism. Scholars like Henry Beveridge, translating Persian chronicles in the late 19th century, often framed Mughal rule as inherently oppressive to Hindus, downplaying instances of Hindu-Muslim amity and shared cultural development. This narrative served to justify British intervention as a necessary force for order and justice. Consider the infamous partition of Bengal in 1905. Officially, it was an administrative decision to improve governance in a large province, but the reality was far more sinister. Lord Curzon, the viceroy, was widely believed to have orchestrated the partition to divide the Bengali population along religious lines, creating a Muslim majority East Bengal and a Hindu majority West Bengal. This sparked massive protests and the Swadeshi movement, which ironically united many Indians against the British. But the underlying principle of dividing communities for administrative ease, which was perceived as religiously motivated, left a deep scar. Though the partition was eventually annulled in 1911, the damage to intercommunal trust was done. The British also played on economic disparities. They often favored certain religious groups for jobs in the administration or the army, creating resentment among those who felt excluded. This wasn't about merit. It was about strategic favoritism to maintain control. For example, in the early 20th century, the British often viewed Sikhs and Gurkhas as more loyal martial races, while other communities were sometimes viewed with suspicion. This created a hierarchy based on perceived religious loyalty, further exacerbating tensions. The Indian National Congress, founded in 1885, aimed for a united, independent India. However, the British actively worked to undermine its secular credentials and encourage the formation of a separate Muslim political entity. They subtly supported and even encouraged the All India Muslim League, founded in 1906, as a counterweight to the Congress. Leaders like Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who initially advocated for Hindu-Muslim unity, were gradually pushed towards the idea of a separate Muslim homeland by the escalating rhetoric and the perceived unresponsiveness of the Congress and the British to Muslim concerns, concerns often amplified by British policy. The British deliberately exaggerated the threat of Hindu domination to Muslims, and vice versa, to maintain their own position as the ultimate arbiter. They allowed and sometimes even encouraged inflammatory speeches and writings that demonized the other community. Newspapers, both British-owned and Indian, often played a role in spreading misinformation and deepening animosity. The Second World War further accelerated this process. With the British Empire weakened, the demand for independence grew stronger. The British, desperate to retain influence, intensified their divide-and-rule tactics. The Cripps mission in 1942 and the Cabinet mission in 1946, while offering proposals for Indian independence, also contained clauses that allowed for the secession of provinces, effectively paving the way for partition. The final act of this tragic play was the decision to partition India. Lord Mountbatten, the last viceroy, is often blamed for the hasty and violent partition in 1947. But the groundwork for this devastating division had been laid meticulously over decades by British policy. The arbitrary drawing of borders, the lack of adequate preparation for the massive population transfers, and the reluctance of the British to fully address the ensuing violence created a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Millions were killed, millions were displaced, and a wound was inflicted that continues to fester. The British government, under Clement Attlee, claimed they were withdrawing from India and leaving it to its own devices. But this was a disingenuous narrative. They were withdrawing from a house they had deliberately set fire to, leaving the inhabitants to deal with the inferno. The responsibility for the communal violence that erupted during and after partition cannot be solely placed on Indian shoulders. It is a direct consequence of over 2 centuries of deliberate British policy. The legacy of divide and rule is not confined to the past. The communal tensions that plague India today, the political polarization, the religious extremism, these are not organic developments. They are the toxic fruits of a colonial strategy designed to weaken and control. The British may have left, but their insidious legacy of division remains. We have presented evidence, names, and dates. We have shown how a foreign power, driven by self-interest, systematically dismantled a complex society by exploiting and exacerbating religious differences. The communalization of Hindus and Muslims was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate, calculated, and ultimately a criminal act of colonial policy. The question remains, when will we truly reckon with these colonial crimes, and what will it take for the subcontinent to finally heal from the wounds inflicted by an empire's insidious divide and rule?